Imagine being born a king, but with a jaw so big you can't chew, a tongue too fat to talk, and a royal family tree so tangled it looks like a wreath. Welcome to the tragicomic saga of Charles II of Spain, the last Habsburg king, a man both pitied and parodied, feared and manipulated, diagnosed by priests and treated with powdered mummy. This isn't your average royal biography. This is the story of a monarch who spent most of his reign as a spectator to his own empire, plagued by deformities, superstitions, bizarre medical treatments, and a court so paranoid they thought demons were hiding in his breakfast. His life was a blend of political theater and gothic horror, with just a pinch of slapstick. In today's episode, we'll travel through the rise and catastrophic fall of a dynasty that trusted genetics a little too much, explore exorcisms in royal bedrooms, two very unfortunate marriages, and the most gruesome autopsy in royal history. Brace yourself for mystery, melancholy, and more than a few awkward chuckles as we unravel the unbelievable but true tale of Charles II of Spain, the king who should have never been born. November 6, 1661, Madrid. King Philip IV and Mariana of Austria welcomed their new baby boy. Fireworks, cannons, bells ringing across Spain, all for a little Habsburg bundle of joy. But behind the embroidered bassinets and courtly smiles, something wasn't quite right. His head, massive, his chin, more of a balcony, his jaw stuck out like a battering ram, his tongue, big enough to host royal banquets on. Madrid erupted in celebration. King Philip IV and Mariana of Austria had just welcomed a long-awaited son. Cannons roared, church bells rang, crowds filled the streets, tossing flowers and prayers into the air. Spain rejoiced at the birth of their future emperor, Charles. A healthy boy, they hoped, a strong one, a beacon of Habsburg glory. But behind the palace walls, among the velvet cradles and golden rattles, whispers quickly replaced cheers. Something wasn't quite right. From the moment he arrived, Charles looked different. His head was massive. Not big baby, big, alarmingly big. His chin jutted out like the prow of a warship. His lower jaw was so pronounced it looked as if someone had tried to attach it backward. His tongue was oversized to the point that it constantly lolled out, too big to fit in his mouth, giving him the permanent expression of someone who just bit into something sour. Even among the Habsburgs, famous for their unique family resemblance, Charles was an extreme case. Why? One word: inbreeding. The Habsburgs didn't just dabble in cousin marriages. They treated it like national policy. Keep the bloodline pure, they said. Keep the power in the family, they insisted. Charles's parents were uncle and niece. That's not a metaphor. That's a genealogical fact. His family tree had fewer branches than a flagpole, and the results showed. As a toddler, Charles lagged behind in nearly every developmental milestone. He didn't walk until he was 4, didn't speak clearly until much later. He was breastfed until nearly age 6. At that age, most noble children were learning fencing and Latin epithets. Charles was still nursing and drooling on priceless carpets. He suffered frequent illnesses, and his growth was stunted. Palace doctors disagreed on whether he was bewitched, cursed, or just unlucky. But the pattern was clear. Charles was fragile, both in body and in mind. Then came 1665. Philip IV died, and 4-year-old Charles became King of Spain. A child barely out of the cradle, too weak to stand unaided, was now head of the world's largest empire. Of course, no one expected him to rule. The real power fell to his mother, Mariana of Austria, a woman with strong opinions, a stronger faith, and a court full of relics, rosaries, and royal ambition. Thus began the reign of Charles II, Spain's boy king, born of blood, crowned in chaos. But Mariana wasn't just any queen mother. She was a deeply devout Catholic with a fervor for saints, sacred bones, relics that allegedly healed boils, and monks who moonlighted as amateur exorcists. Under her regency, the royal court transformed into something resembling a cross between a monastery, a hospital, and a haunted house. Gone were the usual dignified courtly affairs. In their place were prayers, relic processions, and enough holy water to flood half of Madrid. Charles's bedroom looked less like a royal nursery and more like a chapel under siege. His cradle was guarded not by nannies but by clergymen wielding crucifixes and muttering Latin incantations. If Charles so much as coughed, out came the exorcists. At one point, he was tied to his bed while monks surrounded him, waving crosses and saintly femurs like fly swatters. His symptoms, ranging from seizures to drooling, were blamed on witchcraft, the evil eye, and possibly overcooked stew. Physicians, not to be outdone by the clergy, offered their own creative remedies: crushed pearls stirred into goat's milk, powdered unicorn horn, if you could find any, and yes, powdered mummy, scraped from ancient tombs, and sold by the ounce. Because in the royal pharmacy, nothing said health care like a sprinkle of long-dead pharaoh. His meals were no less dramatic. The fear of poisoning had everyone on edge. Every dish was first tested by a line of increasingly anxious servants, some of whom prayed with each bite that it wasn't their last. The royal kitchen became a high-stakes gamble. Would tonight's dinner bring nutrition or necrosis? And through all this, the actual business of running Spain was left to ministers, generals, and whichever faction had Mariana's ear that week. The empire, once the envy of Europe, spiraled into decline. Debt, corruption, and political infighting rotted it from within. Meanwhile, Charles sat quietly, occasionally blinking at candles. With the regency officially over in 1675, Charles was declared King of Spain in his own right at 14. Trumpets blared, titles were read, and the court bowed low. Theoretically, he was now in charge of an empire that stretched from the Philippines to Peru. In practice, however, Charles could barely hold a pen. He couldn't write his own name without smudging the paper. He often signed official documents upside down. When presented with matters of state, he nodded vigorously, like a bobblehead doll with a bad spring, without grasping a single word. Ministers would present him with papers, and he'd stare at them like they were written in Greek. To be fair, Latin was hard enough already. He drooled constantly, so much that the royal stationery sometimes had to be dried before being filed. He suffered from epileptic seizures that left courtiers scrambling to catch him mid-collapse. He occasionally fainted in public events, usually during long masses or ceremonies with more than one candlelit procession. He'd laugh at solemn occasions, cry over still-life paintings, and once reportedly applauded a funeral. Charles was, in short, a living, breathing contradiction, half child, half monarch, and full-time medical marvel. Foreign diplomats walked a diplomatic tightrope. They tried their best to be tactful, but even their dispatches couldn't hide the growing alarm. One French envoy cautiously noted, "His Majesty appears unwell." A British ambassador was more direct. "He is barely sentient, barely sovereign." Behind closed doors, whispers turned into chuckles, and chuckles into worried strategy sessions. Spain's king was fast becoming Europe's most delicate problem. But beneath the vacant stare and the mismatched regalia, there were rare, flickering moments of humanity. Charles, isolated and infantilized all his life, sometimes wept when alone. He asked his confessors if he was being punished by God. He wondered aloud why he was so wrong, why his body failed him, why he couldn't be like his ancestors, bold, feared, respected. There was a soul in there, trapped and stumbling, a man who understood, if only faintly, that he had inherited a kingdom and a body both slowly crumbling before his eyes. Charles may have been a monarch in name, but behind the ritual, the robes, and the royal ceremonies, he was heartbreakingly human. By the late 1670s, the Spanish court faced an urgent problem. The Habsburg dynasty was dangling by a single drooling thread. Charles II had no siblings, no children, and, realistically, no prospects. So to secure the future of the empire, they went searching for a bride who might miraculously produce an heir. The unlucky winner? Marie-Louise of Orléans, niece of the Sun King, Louis XIV. She was everything Charles wasn't: young, intelligent, full of grace, with a head held high and a waist tiny enough to fit through castle doors sideways. Her portrait shimmered with beauty and elegance. Her letters were bright with excitement. She dreamed of marriage, royal power, and perhaps a little French-style romance. And then she met Charles. The wedding was grand, the celebrations lavish, but the royal honeymoon was a different story. Their first night together has been described in diplomatic reports as uneventful, awkward, and, in at least one account, a tragic comedy. Charles, by now a collection of symptoms held together by royal silk, tried to perform his marital duties, but it was like asking a carriage with no wheels to win a race. Between his physical frailty, mental confusion, and general misunderstanding of basic anatomy, consummation was, by all accounts, non-existent. Marie-Louise, stuck in a foreign court with more relics than friends, began to unravel. She was blamed for the lack of children. Courtiers whispered that she was barren, cursed, or simply not trying hard enough. She was watched constantly, barely allowed to correspond with her family, and subjected to daily pressure from ministers and confessors. Romance had fled the palace faster than a court jester with gambling debts. She became depressed, withdrawn. Her vibrant energy turned into tears and silence. She lost weight rapidly, became physically ill, and was often seen wandering the palace gardens alone, clutching letters she wasn't permitted to send. In 1689, she died at just 26 years old. The official cause, appendicitis. The unofficial list, emotional exhaustion, grief, royal isolation, or poison. Everyone had a theory. Charles was devastated. For the first time in his life, he appeared truly human. He wept openly. He refused to eat. He mourned, not as a king, but as a man who had loved, or at least tried to. For once, the puppet had strings of his own. He was not just Charles the Bewitched. He was Charles the Bereaved. After the death of his first wife, Charles II did what every crumbling monarchy does in a crisis. He remarried. Enter Maria Anna of Neuburg, a German princess from a family so fertile they could have populated a small kingdom on their own. She had 23 siblings. If anyone could produce an heir and save the Habsburg line, it had to be her. Maria Anna arrived in Spain with confidence, ambition, and a hefty dose of German bluntness. She expected a husband, perhaps frail, perhaps odd, but what she found was more unsettling than any political pamphlet had prepared her for. Charles was, in her private words, less a man than a prayer request. Their first days together were reportedly spent in awkward silences, confused exchanges, and long gaps where she wondered if she was supposed to say something, or if he'd fallen asleep with his eyes open again. There was no passion, no connection, certainly no heirs. The marriage remained unconsummated, and Maria Anna quickly realized that if she couldn't be a queen mother, she might as well try to be queen puppet master. She threw herself into palace intrigue with the vigor of someone who had nothing else to do. The Habsburg throne was up for grabs, and she began subtly supporting her family's claim to succession. Meanwhile, Charles continued his majestic descent into full-body malfunction. His urine reportedly turned black, perhaps from mercury, perhaps from sorcery, or maybe just from decades of bizarre remedies. His skin took on a sickly yellow hue. His legs ballooned with swelling. He could barely speak. His once garbled mumblings now melted into slurred gibberish. And then came the demons. Charles claimed to see them in the corridors, on the walls, even in his soup. He spoke of witches cursing him, of spirits tormenting him. His nights were restless, his days a blur of groaning, moaning, and increasingly dramatic medical visits. By all logic, he should have been dead. But Charles had one last royal trait left in him: sheer, baffling endurance. He resembled a ghost in royal robes, a zombie in a powdered wig. But still, he lived, somehow. Against reason, against science, and against the hopes of every succession-hungry European diplomat, he kept going. By the final years of his life, Charles II had become something beyond royal, a living fable, a cautionary tale passed around Europe like a ghost story at noble dinner parties. He was less a man and more a medical mystery with a crown. If earlier he resembled a frail monarch clinging to power, now he looked like a half-mummified relic who somehow wandered out of his own tomb. He had no teeth left. His gums were blackened. He couldn't chew, barely swallowed, and had to be fed with spoons of broth by trembling servants. His body oozed from areas too unmentionable for polite society. He could no longer walk or even sit up for long, so he was carried from room to room like an expensive but malfunctioning puppet. He often stared into space for hours, unmoving, unblinking. Courtiers swore they saw him speaking to chairs or laughing at walls. Rumors spread that Charles had, in fact, already died and simply hadn't been told yet. Ministers whispered about opening the royal coffin early, just in case we needed on short notice. And yet, he didn't die. Not yet. Despite every indication that his body had declared mutiny decades ago, Charles continued to breathe. The court, now so accustomed to his decline, didn't know whether to pray or plan. Some ministers started rehearsing their eulogies. The palace began designing funeral outfits. Maria Anna reportedly began writing diplomatic thank you notes to herself, preparing for the influx of condolences and succession debates that would inevitably follow. Across Europe, monarchs and generals sharpened their knives, metaphorically, of course. The moment Charles passed, the War of the Spanish Succession would ignite. Borders were at stake, dynasties would fall, but Charles, the man at the center of it all, just lingered. Until at last, on November 1st, 1700, ironically All Saints' Day, Charles II took his final wheezing breath. He died 5 days shy of his 39th birthday. A priest was present, a bell tolled, a new era of chaos began, and all of Spain exhaled, not just in grief, but in sheer exhausted relief. The long, slow, surreal reign of the most fragile monarch in Europe was finally over. Charles II was gone, and the war for his empty throne had only just begun. The court fell silent, the empire held its breath, and the royal physicians rolled up their sleeves. It was time to answer the question everyone had been quietly asking for years. What on earth was keeping this man alive? The autopsy began in eerie silence, with gloved hands and uneasy glances. What they found would go down in medical lore, not because it was enlightening, but because it was downright disturbing. First, the heart, or rather the tiny, withered thing that used to be one. It was described as the size of a peppercorn, not a poetic metaphor, a literal comparison. How he even circulated blood, let alone survive fevers, exorcisms, and royal drama, with a heart that small remains one of biology's great unsolved mysteries. Then came the lungs. Corroded was the word used. They looked more like burned parchment than organs. His intestines, reduced to black, gelatinous sludge. Physicians recoiled. One report said they seemed to have been rotting for years. Charming. And then there was the skull. Upon opening it, they found it filled with water. Not fluid, not blood. Water. As if Charles had been storing soup in his head instead of brains. It explained the vacant stare, the confusion, the drool. Suddenly, a lot made sense. Last but not least, the royal jewels. His testicles were described as shriveled and black as coal. One can only imagine the awkward pause in the room after that discovery. Was it a result of infection, poor circulation, or perhaps a lifetime of neglect from a body that had given up long ago? The physicians, hardened by years of battlefield surgery and plague dissections, were visibly shaken. Charles II had not just been ill. He had been a walking biological collapse, a man kept upright by ceremony, superstition, and a miracle of royal stubbornness. He wasn't bewitched. He wasn't cursed by a gypsy or struck by divine vengeance. No, Charles was the end product of centuries of genetic roulette, an entire dynasty betting the house on inbreeding and losing spectacularly. What remained on that table wasn't a monarch. It was a medical indictment of an empire, and it would haunt doctors, diplomats, and dynasties for generations to come. After his death, stories flew. Charles had been cursed by witches, haunted by demons, cursed by God. But the real villain? Habsburg inbreeding. Centuries of royal matchmaking reduced to one fragile, tragic, occasionally hilarious man. He ruled nothing, fathered no one, accomplished little. And yet his death shook the world. The War of Spanish Succession erupted, engulfing Europe. Borders changed, monarchies fell, and it all started with a man who couldn't close his jaw. Charles II of Spain, a king by blood, a warning by legacy. He lived like a myth, died like a riddle, and remains one of the most bizarre footnotes in royal history. Sometimes tragic, often comical, always unforgettable. Rest in peace, Your Majesty, preferably somewhere with no cousins.